The Blackwood house stood on its hill like a discarded thought. It watched over the town of Oakhaven with vacant, windowed eyes, its silhouette a jagged tear in the fabric of the sky. No one had lived within its decaying walls for half a century, yet it seemed to breathe, inhaling the damp morning fog and exhaling the long shadows of dusk. They said it was a bad place, a place that had soured long ago. Clara Jennings, however, saw it not as a warning, but as an invitation. She felt its pull in her bones, a low hum of curiosity that had grown into a roar, a story begging to be told to the world. Mark Renfield did not feel the pull. He felt only the damp chill that clung to the air around the wrought iron gates. The gates were rusted shut, their intricate scrollwork choked with ivy and neglect. He watched Clara, her face alight with a feverish excitement that made him uneasy. She saw history and mystery. He saw rot and tetanus. The house was a carcass, picked clean by time and weather. He did not understand her need to walk into its shadowed mouth, to explore its dark and dusty throat. To him, some doors were best left unopened, some stories better left untold for a very good reason. "Isn't it magnificent?" Clara whispered, her voice full of awe as she pushed open the heavy oak door. It groaned in protest, a sound like a waking beast. The air that spilled out was thick and stale, carrying the scent of dust, decay and something else, something faintly sweet and unpleasant, like forgotten flowers. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the thin shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom. The grand foyer was a tomb of forgotten splendor, a sweeping staircase rising into darkness, its banister coated in a fine layer of grey grime. The silence within was a heavy blanket, smothering all sound from the outside world. Mark stepped inside, his practical nature rebelling against every instinct. He ran a hand along the peeling wallpaper. The floral pattern faded and stained with dark, ambiguous blotches. He could feel the house around him, a vast and empty presence. It was not merely quiet, it was waiting. He looked at Clara, who was already drifting toward the parlor, her journalist's eyes scanning every detail, every shadow. He had come to keep her safe, to be the anchor in her storm of obsession. But as the great door swung shut behind them with a deep, final thud, he wondered if he had not just trapped them both inside. The house was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms, each one a separate pocket of silence and decay. They moved through a dining room where the long table was set with dusty plates, as if its spectral diners had only just vanished. They explored a library where books lay swollen and warped on the floor, their stories dissolving into meaningless pulp. Clara documented everything with her camera, the flash a series of small, startling explosions in the oppressive dark. She was methodical, her focus absolute. She was charting the geography of a haunting, mapping the contours of a tragedy she could feel but not yet see. It was in the upstairs master bedroom that the house offered its first secret. The room was dominated by a huge four-poster bed, its curtains rotted to skeletal threads. A faint depression remained in the center of the mattress, a ghostly impression of a body long gone. Clara knelt, her fingers tracing the patterns in the threadbare rug. One of the floorboards near the hearth was slightly loose. It was a small detail, an imperfection that called to her. She felt a strange certainty, a sense that something was waiting for her, just for her, beneath the dusty surface of the floor. With a screwdriver from Mark's toolkit, she carefully pried at the edges of the plank. Mark watched, a frown creasing his brow. "Clara, what are you doing? We shouldn't be tearing the place apart." His voice was a sensible intrusion into the room's deep quiet, but she didn't seem to hear him. The wood groaned and splintered before finally giving way, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. The air that rose from the cavity was cold and smelled of dry paper and secrets. There, nestled in the darkness, was a small leather-bound book. It was a diary. Clara lifted it out as if it were a sacred relic. The leather was dry and cracked with age, the brass clasp tarnished green. There was no name on the cover, no indication of who its author might have been. She held it in her hands, feeling the weight of the words sealed inside. This was it. This was the heart of the house, the key to its sorrow. Mark sighed, a sound of weary resignation. He saw only an old book, another piece of junk in a house full of it. He did not see what Clara saw, a voice, finally unearthed, ready to whisper its story after a century of silence. The days following the discovery of the diary were filled with a new kind of quiet in Clara and Mark's small apartment. It was the quiet of obsession. Clara spent every spare moment with the book, its brittle pages spread open on her desk under a bright lamp. The ink was faded, the handwriting a delicate, spidery script that was difficult to decipher. The words belonged to a man named Eldridge Blackwood, the last master of the house on the hill. He wrote of loneliness, of a profound and suffocating isolation within the grand walls of his home. He wrote of shadows that moved on their own, and of a cold that seeped not from the winter air, but from the very stones of the house. It was then that the whispers began. At first, Clara thought it was just the wind, or the hum of the refrigerator, or the settling of their old apartment building. But the sounds had a particular quality, a sibilant, breathy texture that seemed to form just at the edge of her hearing. They came when she was reading the diary, a soft murmur that seemed to rise from the pages themselves. It was a man's voice, faint and sorrowful. She could never quite make out the words, but she felt their meaning, a deep, aching loneliness, a plea for understanding. She knew with a certainty that defied logic that it was Eldridge. Mark heard nothing. He saw only Clara, growing more distant each day. He would find her sitting in the dark, staring at nothing, a listening expression on her face. "Did you hear that?" she would ask, her eyes wide. He would strain his ears, hearing only the familiar city sounds outside their window. The diary had become a wall between them, its tragic story a third person in their relationship. He tried to reason with her, to plant her feet back on the solid ground of reality, but her obsession was a current pulling her further and further from shore. The whispers grew bolder, clearer. One evening, as Clara read a passage about Eldridge's despair over a lost love, a distinct sighing voice breathed from the corner of the room. "Gone," it said, a single word filled with a century of loss. Clara gasped, dropping the diary. The sound was undeniable, as real as the floor beneath her feet. It was not the wind, it was not her imagination. Eldridge was with her, in her apartment. He had followed her from the house, or perhaps he had been with her all along, waiting for her to listen. The fear was a cold thrill, but it was overshadowed by a profound, terrible excitement. Eldridge's diary was no longer just a source for a story. It had become Clara's entire world. She saw the world through his eyes, felt the chilling despair in his elegant prose. He wrote of the house as a living entity, a jealous companion that kept him isolated. He described its moods, the way the hallways seemed to lengthen on cloudy days, the way doors would slam shut in empty corridors. He confessed a terrible fear of the cellar, of a presence that dwelled in the damp earthen dark beneath the floorboards. The house, he wrote, did not want him to leave. It never wanted anyone to leave. Mark's worry curdled into a deep and gnawing fear for Clara's sanity. She was losing weight, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. She spoke of Eldridge as if he were a living person, a tragic figure she was destined to save. She would set a place for him at their dinner table, only to sit and stare at the empty chair. Mark pleaded with her to stop, to put the diary away, to see a doctor. He argued that she was projecting, that the house and the diary were preying on her journalistic desire for a dramatic narrative. Her obsession was no longer charmingly eccentric. It was dangerous. The whispers were a constant companion for Clara now, a secret conversation that only she could hear. They guided her through the diary, pointing out passages she had missed, offering sorrowful commentary on Eldridge's fate. "So cold," they would murmur as she read of his final winter. "She never came back." They would sigh over entries about his lost love. The voice was no longer just a phenomenon to be investigated. It was a friend, a confidant. She felt a profound connection to this lost soul, a duty to tell his story, and somehow to bring him peace from his restless state. The breaking point came when Mark found Clara's notes. They were no longer the detached observations of a journalist. They were frantic, filled with transcriptions of the whispers, with theories that the house had consumed Eldridge's soul. She had planned a full-scale ghost hunt. She had invited a local psychic, a pair of amateur paranormal investigators, and a skeptical historian. She was going back to the house, not just to observe, but to communicate, to make contact. Mark saw the list of names and felt a cold dread. She was not just chasing a story. She was walking willingly into the heart of the madness. The night of the ghost hunt was heavy and starless. A damp mist clung to the hill, muffling sound and making the Blackwood house look like a ghostly ship adrift on a sea of fog. Clara stood at the gates, her face pale but resolute in the beam of the car's headlights. Mark was beside her, his arms crossed tightly, radiating disapproval. He had come only because he refused to let her face this alone. The others arrived one by one, a stern-faced psychic named Madame Eva, wrapped in shawls despite the mild air. Two young men, Leo and Finn, laden with cameras and audio recorders, and an elderly historian, Mr. Abernathy, who clutched a leather satchel and looked at the house with academic disdain. Inside, the house felt different. The silence was not empty but charged, watchful. It felt as though they had intruded upon a private vigil. Clara, acting as the night's master of ceremonies, directed the group with a feverish energy. She led them through the downstairs rooms, recounting Eldridge's story from the diary, her voice echoing in the cavernous spaces. Leo and Finn set up their equipment, running cables and placing EMF meters on dusty mantles. Madame Eva stood in the center of the foyer, her eyes closed, her hands outstretched as if testing the temperature of the air. "The sorrow here," she murmured. "It is a bottomless well." The tension was a palpable thing, growing with each passing minute. Mr. Abernathy, the skeptic, tried to puncture the atmosphere with rational explanations. "Faulty wiring?" he'd say when a light flickered on a camera. "The wind," he'd insist when a distant door creaked. But even his voice sounded small and uncertain in the vast, listening dark of the house. Mark stayed close to Clara, watching her, his concern a knot in his stomach. She was completely in her element, her eyes bright with a dangerous light. She was not just observing, she was communing with the house. And it seemed to be responding. The first real event happened in the library. As Leo asked into the silence, "Is there anyone here with us?" A book suddenly flew from a high shelf, crashing to the floor with a loud thud that made everyone jump. Finn scrambled to check his audio recorder, his face white. Mr. Abernathy scoffed, but he took a nervous step back. Madame Eva's eyes snapped open. "He is angry," she said, her voice a low tremor. "We are intruders in his solitude." The air grew colder, and from the hallway a faint sighing whisper seemed to drift, too soft for the recorders to catch, but clear enough for Clara to hear. "Leave." The house began to play with them. It was no longer a passive stage for their investigation. It was an active participant, a malevolent trickster. Doors would slam shut down long corridors, their echoes like gunshots in the silence. Footsteps would sound from the floor above, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth in an empty room. Leo and Finn rushed from one spot to another, their equipment flashing and beeping erratically, capturing fleeting electronic voice phenomena, fragments of words, mournful sighs, and one clear, cold whisper that said, "Mine." The hunt had devolved from a structured investigation into a chaotic scramble. The group fractured under the strain. Mr. Abernathy, his skepticism finally shattered, retreated to the foyer, refusing to go any further into the house's depths. Madame Eva began to chant in a low monotone, her face beaded with sweat, as if trying to erect a psychic shield against the oppressive atmosphere. Leo and Finn, though frightened, were also thrilled, chasing after every anomalous sound with the reckless abandon of storm chasers. They were capturing evidence, proof, but they failed to see that they were only agitating the presence that dwelled within the walls, poking it until it lashed out with greater force. Clara, however, was not afraid. She seemed to be in a trance, moving through the chaos with a calm, unnerving purpose. The whispers were constant for her now, a torrent of sorrow and anger flowing directly into her mind. She understood. Eldridge wasn't a single coherent spirit. He was a part of the house. His consciousness merged with the wood and stone. It was the house itself that was lonely. The house that was angry, using the memory of Eldridge as its voice. It wanted them to feel its endless solitude, its suffocating despair. It wanted them to stay and become part of its collection of silent souls. The chaos reached its peak in the upstairs hallway. The temperature plummeted and their breath plumed in the air. All of Finn's camera batteries died at the exact same moment. Then the portraits lining the hall, their painted eyes seeming to watch, began to rattle against the wall. One by one they crashed to the floor, the sound of shattering glass echoing like screams. A wail rose from the end of the hall, a sound of pure, inhuman grief that went on and on. It was a sound that scraped at the soul. In the ensuing panic, Finn tripped and fell, and Leo scrambled to help him, shouting for everyone to get out. The house was awake and it was furious. In the midst of the pandemonium, as Leo dragged a terrified Finn toward the stairs, Clara walked away from the group. She moved as if pulled by an invisible string, turning not toward the exit, but deeper into the house, toward the master bedroom where she had first found the diary. Mark saw her go, his heart seizing with terror. "Clara!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the house's mournful cry. The others were already clambering down the grand staircase, their only thought of escape. He was alone, faced with a choice: flee with the others, or follow Clara into the heart of the storm. He did not hesitate. He ran down the hallway, the air thick and cold around him, pushing against him like a physical force. The whispering intensified, no longer a faint murmur but a vortex of sound, 100 voices speaking at once, all with Eldridge's sorrowful tone. They swirled around Mark, accusing and pleading. "Stay, lonely, mine, forever." He pushed through the wall of sound, his focus entirely on the open doorway to the master bedroom. He could see Clara standing inside, silhouetted against the pale, misty light from the window. She was not alone. A shape was coalescing in the center of the room, near the great four-poster bed. It was a column of shadow, a patch of darkness deeper than the surrounding gloom. It shifted and writhed, slowly taking on a vague human form. It was tall and gaunt, a silhouette of pure misery. This was the presence, the thing that called itself Eldridge, the sorrow of the house given shape. Clara stood before it, her hand outstretched, not in fear but as if in greeting. She was speaking to it in a low voice, words of comfort and understanding, trying to soothe the ancient pain. Mark watched in horror as the shadowy figure seemed to reach for her. It did not have hands, but tendrils of darkness unspooled from its form, drifting toward Clara's outstretched arm. The house groaned around them, a deep structural sound as if it were contracting, holding them in its grasp. The air crackled with energy and the temperature dropped so low that frost began to form on the window panes. Mark knew with absolute certainty that if those shadows touched her, she would be lost. She would become another whisper in the dark, another memory trapped within the walls of Blackwood House. "Clara, no!" Mark's voice was a raw shout, cutting through the swirling whispers and the groaning of the house. He lunged into the room, grabbing Clara by the arm and pulling her back with all his strength. She struggled against him, her eyes still fixed on the shadowy form, her expression one of rapt fascination. "Let me go!" she cried, her voice sounding distant, strange. "He needs me! He's all alone!" The connection was almost complete. The house was moments away from claiming her, from drawing her into its lonely embrace and silencing her forever. The shadowy presence recoiled as Mark intruded, its form wavering and distorting. A wave of intense cold washed over him, so profound it felt like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The whispers rose to a furious shriek in his ears, a cacophony of rage and despair. "Leave her, she is mine!" The voice was not just in the room, it was inside his head, a violation that made him want to claw at his own skull. He held on to Clara, his knuckles white, his feet planted as if trying to anchor himself against a hurricane. He was the skeptic, the practical man, now face to face with an impossible reality. He looked into Clara's eyes and saw not his girlfriend but a stranger mesmerized by a dark promise. He had to break the spell. "Clara, listen to me. It's not Eldridge, it's the house. It's lying to you," he yelled, his words desperate. "The diary said it wouldn't let him leave. It wants you too. Don't let it take you." He pulled her toward the door, dragging her away from the dark figure. For a moment she resisted, her body rigid. Then something in his words, a sliver of the truth she had ignored, seemed to break through the fog of her obsession. Her eyes cleared, and the rapt expression was replaced by a wave of pure terror. With a final agonized roar that shook the entire room, the shadowy forms surged toward them. Mark didn't wait to see what would happen. He spun around, pulling Clara with him, and they stumbled out of the bedroom and into the hallway. Behind them, the door slammed shut with the force of an explosion, the sound echoing through the house like a final, hateful goodbye. They didn't look back. They scrambled down the main staircase, past the shattered portraits and the abandoned equipment, and burst out through the front door into the cleansing mist of the night. They ran from the house on the hill and did not stop until the car was miles away, its headlights cutting a safe, bright path through the normal, silent darkness of the countryside. They did not speak. There were no words for what they had seen, for the cold they still felt deep in their bones. The silence in the car was heavier than any silence they had experienced in the house, because this silence was filled with the memory of sound, of whispers, of a mournful wail, of a door slamming shut on a century of sorrow. The ghost hunt was over, the story was found, but the cost was a piece of themselves left behind in that dark waiting room. In the weeks that followed, Clara and Mark tried to return to their life. But the experience had left a permanent scar on the landscape of their relationship. Mark, the skeptic, could no longer dismiss the shadows in the corner of his eye. He would wake in the night, certain he had heard a faint, sorrowful whisper. Clara, the seeker of truth, was now terrified of it. She put the diary away in a locked box and never wrote a single word of the story of Blackwood House. Her obsession had been burned out of her, replaced by a hollow, quiet fear. The thrill was gone, leaving only the trauma. The house had changed them irrevocably. Their easy comfort with one another was replaced by a shared, unspoken dread. Sometimes Mark would look at Clara and see the rapt, distant expression she wore in that final moment, and a chill would run down his spine. She had been so close to the edge, so willing to step into the darkness. And she had looked at him, the man who grounded her, and saw a stranger pulling her away from her purpose. They had escaped the house together, but they had brought its haunting back with them, a ghost that now sat between them at their dinner table. They stayed together, bound not by love or comfort anymore, but by a shared secret, a shared terror. They were the only two people who truly knew what had happened that night. The house on the hill still stands, watching over the town, keeping its secrets. But sometimes on a quiet night when the wind is just right, Clara is certain she can hear a faint, familiar whisper carried on the breeze, a lonely voice calling her name. She had sought to uncover the truth beneath the floorboards, and in the end, she had. The truth was that some doors are meant to remain closed, and some voices are meant to remain unheard, lest they follow you home.